Universalism or the apokatastasis, and let's talk about that first, and let's talk about David Bentley Hart's view, and then let's talk about the other issues that kind of undergird that. So he has a view that is, in my estimation, evolved out of where he kind of started out with the right idea, where he noticed that the Orthodox view teaches what's called recapitulation. And this is a doctrine that's taught by Paul, Irenaeus, most of the Eastern Fathers, all the way up into the Seventh Council really clearly. And this is the idea that when Jesus assumed human nature, he assumed it in a universal sense in his singular divine hypostasis. And so this is why his resurrection is able to affect the resurrection of every single human being, because he didn't just assume a singular human body. He did, but that human body also, in a real metaphysical way, is connected to all human beings, even the wicked. And that's the only basis, according to 1 Corinthians 15, for all men to be resurrected. So that far, if you only have that much of the story, you might think, well, that sounds like, or would lead to, universalism. Like, wouldn't everybody be reconciled? And isn't this a cosmic scope of redemption, like St. Maximus says? Well, that's only part of the story, because there's more to this, especially when we get into the more nuanced nature-person theology of St. Maximus. So the reason that St. Maximus can believe in, and many other Eastern Fathers can believe in, the doctrine of recapitulation, but not universal salvation, is because of the fact that the distinction between nature and person is fundamental to Orthodox theology, both in the Trinity and in Christology and in anthropology. So the way that this applies in anthropology is that just because universal human nature is restored via Christ's action in the death, burial, resurrection, and ascension, does not mean that every individual hypostasis will achieve theosis. So the mode in which we participate in Christ or in theosis is different. And this is answered, I believe, off the top of my head, I think it's Athanasium 15, where St. Maximus points out that the way in which you will participate in Christ will differ on the basis of your willing, your individual mode of willing, which is your inhypostatic or personal mode of willing, and use of nature. So the way that you use nature, even though everyone's nature is determined to be resurrected, the way that you use that nature in this life is what will determine your participation in theosis or your ever ill-being. So Maximus says, even though Christ grants to everyone ever being, he does not grant to everyone ever well-being unless they actualize the potentia that they have in terms of repenting and turning to Christ and joining the church. So the only way that you participate in theosis is by your individual hypostatic mode of willing, actualizing the grace that is there in potentia for everybody via the recapitulation, thus to join the church. So it's not just any religion, you actually have to join the church. The graces, as St. Maximus says, I think in Athanasium 15, lead us to join the church. So that's why it's not salvation for everybody across the board.
There's the liberal view of universal salvation, where it's just like, oh, you know, you die.
Right. In other words, so here's the point to summarize: the liberal view collapses person into nature and just sort of universalizes everybody being saved because of Christ assuming universal human nature. But the traditional view of Maximus and the Church Fathers is not that. There is still a distinction between nature and person, and so in one sense, yes, all of human nature is restored, but that does not mean that your experience of the eschaton will be good, because if you're wicked, you're going to be restored to experiencing the river of fire, which is the same thing as the river of life. So in other words, it's an individual, the individual's actions determine how they will experience the eschaton. So in other words, we believe that the river of life that proceeds from the throne of the Lamb in the Apocalypse is the same thing as the river of fire, because God's presence, which is described by Paul in Hebrews as fire, is not a created thing. God himself is a consuming fire. He is uncreated fire. So you're either prepared for that uncreated fire via theosis, or you're not prepared and you live wickedly and you're going to experience God as a bad thing.
Anybody here has ever tried psychedelics, and they've ever tried like a super high dose, and you can't handle it. Right, I've had this experience where it feels like a burning fire, right? And you're not prepared for it, and it's likewise like, okay, I don't want to equate God's love with this.
Well, no, but I mean, I think the analogy is correct, right? So the idea would be that we're all going to the same place, and some of us are going to have the the suit that's prepared for it, or we won't.
Right, but God doesn't want to punish us because for punishment's sake. And so where I'm trying to get this is like I do believe in the sort of hierarchy of reward, and that like if you did join the church, even the quote unquote right church, be it the Roman Catholic or the Orthodox Church, which like I would understand here most people are Orthodox, right? But that this person who did all the right things in the right dispositions, right? That they should have a proper reward, right? That's after all, Jesus did say, "Store up our treasures in heaven," right? So I do believe that like there is a sort of hierarchy of reward. It's not just like, oh, you're human and you die and you're going to be saved. Like that's what a liberal universal salvation would believe. Whereas like I think David Bentley Hart, he speaks more of universal redemption, where like eventually everyone is going to get redeemed. Where and then I'll add a little bit more to me. For my part, it's like you're gonna get to the party eventually, but if you get there earlier, you're gonna get a better seat at the table. The Bible also says every knee shall bend and every tongue shall profess that Jesus Christ is Lord. It's not because
but that doesn't mean that
the wicked say it like out of force.
No, they do.
Out of pain.
No,
right?
they do. They
eventually,
do. Hold on.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Let me just pause you there because I understand where you're going. And I remember when I was first looking at Orthodoxy, I toyed with this position because I thought, well, within Orthodoxy, there's a bunch of different types of positions. And so I thought, well, Gregory of Nyssa seems to have this position. And so if St. Gregory of Nyssa had this position, then maybe it's still true. And the problem is that just because a church father had a position does not therefore mean that that's a viable position within Orthodoxy, right? So many church fathers have positions that eventually ecumenical councils don't accept or reject. And so the first problem here is that from a dogmatic standpoint, there's 3 ecumenical councils that explicitly condemn this form of universalism where you can be saved after the judgment. So there is no salvation after the judgment, and that's why we can't adopt. That's another. The next point in my notes I was making over here was that we can't come up with a position that contradicts the 5th, 6th, and 7th councils just because I found an earlier church father like St. Gregory of Nyssa who had this kind of an opinion. If we were to do that, we would be like Protestants with the church fathers. We could come up with all kinds of crazy, now would be perceived as heterodox views, because many church fathers disagreed on all kinds of things. So this is not actually a position that is tenable after the 5th, 6th, and 7th councils explicitly condemn this kind of universalism. Right. So in the 5th council, the teaching of Origenism is condemned, and specifically his version of universalism. The 6th council expands that to talk specifically about the totality of Origen's system and universalism and the idea that universal salvation can be possible. The 7th council reaffirms the 6th council, and where it's condemned in the 6th council, which most people don't know, is called the Confession of St. Sophronius. So St. Sophronius was close to St. Maximus, and he wrote this confession that he submitted to the council, which the council accepted. Most people haven't read this because it was only recently published in English through Oxford University. But if you look up the Confession of St. Sophronius of Jerusalem, it has a 4-page full condemnation of all of the teaching of Origen. So the 6th council is actually accepting St. Sophronius' full-on condemnation of Origenism. And so I'm just saying that when the 7th council reaffirms the 6th council's condemnation, that's 3 ecumenical councils that are condemning this idea. So I'm well aware of what David Bentley Hart argues, but it really is just like grasping at straws on the basis of human wisdom and human arrogance to say, well, we know better than those 3 ecumenical councils, right? That's why these people that's why these people have a motivation to resurrect Origenism, is because they're actually ecumenists / universalists / perennialists, and they find Origenism to be the means by which this ecumenist perennialist religion can be sort of propped up. So if you want to be a perennialist, you can go in the route of David Bentley Hart, but that's not orthodox. And by the way, David Bentley Hart started out as a traditional pro-monarchy orthodox person who was arguing for good Trinitarian theology, and then for whatever reason, whatever happened to him, I don't know, but within about 10 years, he became a democratic socialist, complete, just off the rails. So I don't believe that he's even orthodox.
Gravitating more to fix the legalism of like, okay,
that's not how. That's not. You're thinking of the Orthodox Church like a Roman Catholic would, and I know what you're going through because I went through this exact same situation where I was tired of traditional Catholicism's legalism and scrupulous attitude. And so the appeal of something like David Bentley Hart appeals because it's seen to be kind of a medicinal corrective to the extremes of traditional Latin Catholicism. But what I'm trying to tell you is that that's a false way to conceive of it, because the way that you go about Orthodox theology is you have to be in the church and living the Orthodox life to understand the theology. And so there's a process that occurs, especially for people who are Calvinists or traditional Roman Catholics like myself. It took me 10 years to get out of that like hardcore trad Catholic mindset and have a better understanding of what's going on in terms of the nuance of Orthodox theology. So what I'm saying is that you can't put up this idea that therefore, because of the extremities of Latin legalism, therefore it's always legalistic for the ecumenical councils to have dogmatic pronouncements. How are we going to say that the church and 3 ecumenical councils fundamentally misunderstood the gospel? It's just not possible.
Right.
Again, I think the point here would be to, first of all, notice that I think the motivations for the argumentation, I'm not saying you're bad for asking those questions, but the motivations come out of a traditional Catholic mindset where, for example, in St. Alphonsus Liguori, he's not a saint for Orthodox, but like he has just sermons and volumes of books about how you're supposed to constantly use your imagination to think of all of the worst types of punishments that you could feel. And it's almost sadomasochism. You're basically just supposed to sit there and meditate on the ways that you can be tortured. I'm not joking. That's in his sermons. And so with that kind of a mindset, it's no wonder that people would begin to say this religion doesn't make sense, right? I mean, I've got, for example, Canon. This is a classic traditional Catholic sort of catechism book. This is the Faith by Canon Francis Ripley, like SSPX, Trad Catholics, they love this book. And, he's got a whole section, for example, on pages 189 to 191, where he talks about how far you can walk on the Lord's Day before it becomes laborious work and you've committed a mortal sin. So literally you could be in a, quote, state of grace, walk a little too much on the Lord's Day and you've committed a mortal sin and now you're damned. I mean, it's just crazy. That's a ridiculous religion. And no wonder people go from Papa Frank's church to atheism, right? Or perennialism or whatever kind of thing they think is a little more coherent. But the difference is that isn't the Orthodox view of how we relate to God and what hell is. Again, the point was that I think you mentioned C.S. Lewis. Have you ever read The Great Divorce?
Yeah, I have. It's one of my favorite books.
Yeah, that's the point, right? So in that book, the point is that no one is going to that without them consciously deciding that that's what they want.
Right, but it's kind of like, what kind of love is that God is just going to abandon?
Well, hold on. So hold on. You're saying that that's not love and that's not fair. Like, on what basis what's the basis for? Hold on, man.
It's fair,
dude. I've let you talk a whole bunch. On what basis do you have a standard for what is love and what is fair? Like, where do you derive that?
From God, from what is good.
Okay, but from God, that's via revelation. And if revelation teaches that he does, condemn the wicked, then how do you, then that's begging the question. You can't say it's unfair. I understand what you're saying, but the flaw in that argument was a Hellenic view that we only choose evil because we think it's a good. And that's not true. That's a Greek view of ethics and human anthropology. It's not the biblical doctrine of anthropology. So what this is boiling down to is a Hellenic presupposition, which is what the Roman Catholic presuppositions ultimately are, that you're then saying, well, therefore God's not fair because of my Greek Plato presuppositions about anthropology.
Right.
Why do you believe, hold on, let's go back to that premise. Why do you believe that people only choose bad thinking that it's a good? Because that's not biblical theology. Why do you think that that's the case?
Because otherwise they wouldn't do it. Like even a wicked person.
Nope, that's begging the question.
Wicked, they're
No,
doing it for at least some sick pleasure, right? Like,
but that doesn't mean that. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that they're not evil. That they're only doing it in ignorance. So the assumption here is that all sins are
evil to an extent, right? Some
No,
people
that's not true.
have-
You're assuming that all evil actions are only done out of ignorance. That's not true.